Shalom, friends. Welcome back to Jewish Book Reactions. I was up until 2 o'clock this morning to finish reading The Madwoman in the Rabbi's Attic, Rereading the Women of the Talmud by Gila. Let me tell you about this book's unbreakable chokehold on me. So in my years-long process at this point in learning Talmud, and for those of you who have seen my videos, you know that sometimes I have challenges in encountering some of the stories and teachings about women. As I am one, sometimes I do take it a smidgen personally, but generally speaking, it's the way in which women are seemingly othered by the text. But what Gila does in this book is examine the stories of the named women who get their own Talmudic narrative. All 6 of them. So many. Yalta, Choma, Marta, Cheruta, Beruria, and Ima Shalom. 2 of whom, Yalta and Beruria, are represented on this very t-shirt. Gila explains that each woman, at first glance, does embody an anti-feminist archetype. For example, Yalta is the shrew, Choma is a femme fatale, Cheruta is the Madonna-whore dichotomy, and so on. Personally, I never saw Yalta as a shrew, but I guess one person's shrew is another person's iconic bad bitch. But I take the point. Gila argues that this initial read doesn't tell us the full story, and that full story can sometimes be a lot more nuanced and insightful when approached from a new direction with broader context, which is exactly what this book does. So as we go through the book, we can begin to see the light bending around each archetype until the woman at the center of each story is revealed more clearly as complex and extraordinary, and maybe not at all who we thought they were. And that, in turn, reveals so much about the storytellers of the Talmud itself and the literary structures that they utilized. So what the author does is lead us through 2 separate reads of the story of each character. She does a broad cross-cultural overview of the archetype being dismantled. For example, with Yalta the shrew, Fine obviously brings in Shakespeare, of course, Greek philosophy, the Arabian Nights stories, Dickens, and most brilliantly, in my humble opinion, Bertha Mason, the character from Jane Eyre, the first wife of Mr. Rochester who keeps her in the attic. After this cultural overview, Fine begins mapping the structure of the narratives, dividing it into acts like a play, analyzing the characters, following the storylines, examining the motifs at work. And then we zoom back out again for the context in which the story takes place, both the context in the Talmudic discussion that surrounds it and the historical context. Then we revisit that story with everything deconstructed to find out how very wrong we were on our initial read. At the end of each chapter, Fine offers a moral of the story, a takeaway for us. And what I love about these last bits of the chapters is how much of it is about de-othering the other. While I enjoyed the hell out of the entirety of this book, the whole thing is a mindfuck in the best possible way. I gotta give a special shout out to the chapter about Beruria, which I read and reread last night. Put it down, picked it back up, stared into the past, stared into my soul, screamed into the void, had the void scream back at me. To me, there have been very few things quite as disturbing in my learning of the Talmud as the horrific character assassination of the great female sage, Beruria. The Beruria incident, quotation marks, which is not explained in the Talmud itself, but rather has an explanation sourced in the Rashi commentary. According to the Rashi, after her whole incredible story, Beruria commits adultery and then unalives herself, which seems based on the paradigm, the archetype she's in, to be the natural comeuppance for being a woman outlearning the men, for her hubris. When Rabbi Eliezer from the Oven of Aknai story said that women shouldn't learn Torah, see, he was right. If you as a woman have thoughts, eventually it's unavoidable, you will become a thought. Nothing you can do about it, so don't start thinking now. But this chapter dismantles this whole idea down to like a molecular level, burns it away. The character assassination really did happen, we all know that, but Beruria never committed adultery or unalived herself. And to read this chapter vindicating her and vindicating the sages around her and revealing the real origin of the Beruria incident was frankly so dramatic and cathartic. So some of my notes in the margins include: submit this chapter to all the film festivals, give it an EGOT. Holy shit, it was Kaiser Soze the whole time. Mic drop. Real fake Rashi. This is sending me into orbit. Don't trust the Rashi, it's been contaminated. Red alert, red alert, red alert. And finally, I am deceased. Now I want to read you a little selection from the moral of the story part of the end of the Beruria chapter. The moral of the story, the danger of stigma. Let us then save the reputation Beruria worked so hard to protect. Nowhere in the Talmud, once we remove the destructive influence of the Beruria incident, do we find any trace of criticism directed at Beruria. The rabbis of the Talmud, far from accusing Beruria of derision or arrogance or promiscuity, seem to have nothing but high regard for her. They accept her into their ranks and don't even mind when they are repeatedly defeated by her. In this, the rabbis are far more noble than many of us. The most tolerant among us, who most readily accept the other into our midst, still cannot bear to be outdone by them. So we stigmatize, slapping on a label designed to keep them in their place. A powerful woman is promiscuous. A political adversary has got to be unscrupulous. A wealthy foreigner must have cheated his way to the top. Such stigmas destroy reputations. They ruin lives. They all but destroyed Beruria's legacy. But if the rabbis were able to get past their stigma, were able to acknowledge the superiority of a learned woman without labeling her licentious, we ought to be able to do so as well. As opposed to the Mishnah, which blots out Beruria's name for the sake of modesty, and the medieval legend, which sullies it with charges of immodesty, the rabbis of the Talmud treat Beruria without sanction or stigma, simply as one of their own. That was very healing. Look, I know that this book has received a staggering number of incredibly glowing reviews, and the book jacket has a ton of beautifully worded blurbs. But so far, I have not found a review that says the following in these exact words, so let me do it. Holy fucking shit. Gila Fine is a fucking genius. Baruch Hashem, she didn't listen to Rabbi Eliezer ben Harkness, because guess what? Gila Fine's work is what you get when women study and teach Talmud. Unbelievable, incandescent, astonishing teachings that bring us closer to the text and to understanding ourselves, our people, our history, and how to be better human beings in this very unpleasant world. On a scale of 6 named women with storylines, I give this book a perfect 10. Go forth and read it, on the way to load or otherwise.